Buenas tardes y bienvenidos. Para esta presentación contaremos con los servicios de interpretación al español en simultáneo. Para acceder al canal en español, en unos momentos usted podrá observar en la barra de herramientas en la parte inferior de su pantalla el icono de un globo terráqueo. Al seleccionar este icono, usted podrá elegir su idioma de preferencia. Albert, I'm ready to be assigned as interpreter.
Thank you, Pamela. My name is Albert Garcia, and I'm a librarian with Contra Costa County. Welcome, and thank you for being here today. Before I hand it over to the League of Women Voters, I do want to say a little bit about library services. The Contra Costa County Library is happy to connect you with our resources, services, and materials at all 26 of our branches. Access more than 1 million physical items, including international language collections and thousands of digital materials 24/7 at ccclib.org. Visit any library to use our public computers, printers, and free Wi-Fi. You can also visit one of our branches with laptops for on-site use or check out a Wi-Fi hotspot for 3 weeks. Contra Costa County Library's adult literacy program trains and supports volunteer tutors to deliver basic literacy instruction to adults throughout the county. Visit our website and sign up for a digital library card today. I'm now going to hand it over to Diane from the League of Women Voters. Thank you, Diane, for this wonderful program. It's all yours.
My apologies, it took me a moment to get back to where everybody is, so here I am. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Diane Bianchi, and on behalf of the Contra Costa County Library, the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley, the League of Women Voters West Contra Costa County, and Contra Costa County TV, welcome to our community conversation webinar, Disinformation, How to Recognize and Respond to It. Before we begin, I would like to review a few housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, so the audience's microphones are muted and the videos are turned off. In addition to the Zoom closed caption, this webinar also offers an ASL interpreter. If you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. A member of our team will share your questions with the panelists during the Q&A portion of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the YouTube channels of the Contra Costa County Library and the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley. Site addresses for those YouTube channels will be displayed on screen at the end of the program. Additionally, Contra Costa Television is broadcasting this webinar today and will rebroadcast the program. The dates and times will be posted on your screen at the end of the webinar. Contra Costa Television is available to watch on Comcast, Channel 27, AT&T UVerse Channel 99, Astound Channel 32, and online at contracostatv.org. We will also post the contact information for our panelists and the date and subject of our next community conversation at the end of this program. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization working to protect and expand voting rights and ensure everyone is represented in our democracy. We empower voters and defend democracy through advocacy, education, and litigation at the local, state, and national levels. The League of Women Voters of the United States believes that democratic government depends upon informed and active participation at all levels of government. We invite you to join the League of Women Voters and support our work. You can join the League by visiting lwvc.org/join. The Democracy Truth Project, part of the League of Women Voters Women Powered Democracy campaign, aims to strengthen democracy and restore trust in the electoral process by combating mis- and disinformation. The project leverages the extensive expertise of League leaders and partners to provide the public with information and tools to participate in our democracy and restore trust in the political system. To see the mis- and disinformation tools the League offers, please visit lwv.org/blog/your-guide-mis and disinformation, and this will be posted in the chat. Now I would like to introduce Deanna Troust and Mackenzie Sadaji. Deanna Troust is a award-winning communication strategist and founder of Truth in Common, a nonprofit that forwards human-centered approaches for tackling the linked epidemics of mis- and disinformation and social division. Deanna leads workshops for community members, develops disinformation disrupting strategies for organizations, speaks to professional groups, and brings communicators to the table in tackling this pressing global issue. Visit truthincommon, all one word, .org. Deanna's consulting firm, 3storiescom.com, all one word, which specializes in inclusive communication strategies, or find her on LinkedIn or Threads. This is again will be posted in the chat. Mackenzie Sadaji is acting news verification editor for NewsGuard. Sadaji previously worked as a fact checker and reporter at USA Today, focusing on misinformation related to the COVID-19 pandemic, elections, and international conflicts. As an undergrad at Arizona State University, Walter Cronkite School, she covered politics for Arizona PBS and worked at the college publication, The State Press. She is currently completing a master's program at Georgetown University. Welcome, Deanna and Mackenzie.
Thank you so much, Diane. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to be speaking first in this presentation, and I'm so excited to be here. I love working with libraries, and I love working with League of Women Voters chapters. So thank you so much. I wanted to begin by sharing a little bit of why I am here with you today. In 2016, when powerful people began discrediting mainstream sources of information and media through the term fake news, I thought it was possible that we had a pretty big problem on our hands. I also wanted to talk to people at the community level about the issue. So I left my hometown of Washington, D.C., and went to my parents' community in Southern Pennsylvania and led a discussion group about that very topic. I found so much more common ground than one might think, and including in the sources of information that people did consume. And I also found some confusion. And this was 2017. Fast forward to today, we have the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report this January, talking about mis- and disinformation as emerging as the most severe global risk anticipated over the next 2 years. Foreign and domestic actors alike will leverage mis- and disinformation to further widen societal and political divides. Our approach is community-based. We lead, as Diane said, we lead workshops for community members, often through the libraries. We organize and train frontline professionals and help organizations develop strategies with the goal of restoring civil discourse and access to fact-based information. This is not about telling anyone what to believe or the decisions that they should make, simply offering access to the truth so they can make the best decisions for them in a very relational setting. So I could share multiple pages about the threats of disinformation, but in a nutshell, this phenomena threatens democracies and institutions around the world. People, when messages about, for example, Democrats replacing white people with immigrants and Jews, people are sometimes incited to violence, as happened in the El Paso Walmart with Hispanic shoppers, in Buffalo with Black shoppers, in Pittsburgh with Jews attending service, and in Christchurch, New Zealand at a Muslim faith community. Disinformation erodes trust in mainstream sources of information, and thus erodes the sources of information themselves. We know that local news is declining as a resource, and local news is necessary for us to have functioning communities. This map shows news deserts in the US. Mis and disinformation and eroding trust in news also allows hedge funds like Alden Global Capital to step in and purchase outlets. Luckily, people care about this issue. This study found that Americans on both sides of the political aisle found mis and disinformation a significant problem in society. So I wanted to align on terms. These are kind of complex terms in that they connote both falsehoods and the way the falsehoods travel. Misinformation refers to falsehoods that are shared by people innocently. Disinformation, on the other hand, you can see in the intent continuum here, refers to falsehoods that are shared intentionally with the goal of creating harm or confusion. On the other side, we have malinformation, which is when people start with the truth and tell a false story about it. Some examples. This one's a little more whimsical. Someone impersonating Governor Greg Gianforte of Montana on Twitter, saying that he had born his child through Immaculate Conception. We call that disinformation, since the person clearly knew that that wasn't true. Then we have Lawrence Tribe, law professor emeritus at Harvard, sharing that piece of information, that piece of content, with a quip. We don't know whether he believed it or not, probably not. But the fact is that he shared it anyways, and perhaps some people who saw it took it at face value. Certainly it was shared by others, can emerge. An example, some examples of malinformation. Both of these examples are when folks took actual video and told a false story around it. On the right is the Georgia indictment. You've heard the stories of the election workers in Georgia who were accused of fraudulent behavior because some individuals pulled surveillance footage and told a false story about what was happening there. Eventually, these workers were targeted with attempts on their life. One had to move, and now they've finally had their day in court. We call that malinformation. So Camille Francois of Graphica gave us a nice framework for diagnosing and analyzing mis and disinformation. A, for manipulative actors with that intent to disrupt either democratic processes or the information ecosystem. B, deceptive behaviors. What tactics and techniques are they using? C, harmful content. And we'll show some examples. And then some had the great idea to add a D, which is for information distribution. How does the information diffuse and spread? And this is super important because often this issue is not attacked or addressed simply by fact checking. We have to see how information travels and its influence along the way. So let's look at actors. Why do they do what they do? This individual made a lot of money creating videos for Alex Jones' channel InfoWars. Others are trying to further in-group, out-group thinking, the polarization that we're experiencing in our spaces. Sometimes folks are pushing a political or social agenda to spark violence, as mentioned earlier, often racially or politically motivated, and cast doubt and cause chaos. I share this older article because the lead author, Craig Silverman, is one of the early voices in this space who identified, for example, troll farms in Macedonia who were cranking out mis and disinformation about both sides of a political race in order to cause confusion. Deceptive behaviors. Mackenzie is going to speak more about AI. And I wanted to make it clear that in this webinar, we're going to be talking about generative AI. So AI platforms that create information from scratch, not other AI solutions. Obviously, as most of you have seen, the concern with generative AI is creating synthetic content that is itself inauthentic. It's false. We know that we've seen the term hallucination to refer to that. I was on a webinar recently, and these are some things that I wanted to share to watch out for. Not just video, but audio impersonations as well, including of trusted messengers. The content, as these platforms grow more savvy, gets more personal and convincing. The webinar leader's words, everything translated everywhere. It's much easier to translate information into multiple languages with these platforms, thereby creating more culturally competent information that can be in itself more convincing than it was before. The conflict in Israel and between Israel and Hamas has been, as this website, which I'll tell you about in a second, says, has seen misinformation at unprecedented levels. If you're looking for information about the war, particularly how mis and disinformation are spreading, I might steer you to this resource, the EU Disinformation Lab. This inset shows the resource is a sort of screenshot from the resource. This is a screenshot from one of its pages that references, as you may have seen in the press, how Telegram became an incredible vector for mis and disinformation around the war, how verified accounts on X or Twitter, and the verification process doesn't mean much anymore since you can pay for it now, are throwing around the terms OSINT quite regularly, which stands for open source intelligence, and that now some of the platforms that have arisen to identify inauthentic content are being misused to show that real content is false. To social science to see the different types of inauthentic content that we may see on social media or even in in-person engagement, satire and parody, critical context missing. This article from the Truth in Common newsletter is about critical race theory, which evolved from a concept that no one really understood or knew about to public policy in 4 months. This used a propaganda technique called a data void. People didn't know what it meant, the term critical race theory, which lived, of course, in law school circles. So others who had political and other agendas were able to tell a story about critical race theory and how it was influencing elementary, middle, and high schools. And that 4-month trajectory from a Fox commentary to public policy was unprecedented. Imposter content. In an election-related example, just a few days ago, we saw breaking news on false videos of British Prime Minister Sunak that showed up via paid content, over 100 ads. And the story those ads told was that Elon Musk had developed an app that was tracking the stock market. And Prime Minister Sunak showed up in this video saying that the British government was testing it. If you click through on the ad, you found an investment scam. So why Prime Minister Sunak, and in this sort of trumped up story, which of course is incredible, is completely false? Well, his video, his image, and his voice is out there in spaces. It's easy to obtain and copy, thereby making the AI deepfake that much easier to produce. These are the kinds of things we need to look out for. In a related example, not related, but related in the sense that it's another deepfake example, is the story from Slovakia. Michal Šimečka, who is the opposition candidate, was shown in a video purportedly talking to a journalist about how he was going to rig the election by pulling votes. This was completely manufactured, complete deepfake, inauthentic content, but it was launched when there was a journalism moratorium. So investigative journalists weren't able to investigate it and refute it. Unfortunately, Šimečka lost, even though he was favored to win. Here's a story from further back in the 2016 election when Black voters in battleground states were targeted with messages designed to get them to stay home. confusing messages on both sides of the aisle with regard to the candidates. And in fact, in those states, there was the first drop in Black turnout in 20 years. This was the data mining of Facebook data that was helped along by Cambridge Analytica. Distribution. Here's a study from a former partner of mine at Cybersecurity for Democracy at NYU that found that misinformation on Facebook got 6 times more engagement, more clicks, likes, and shares than factual news during the 2020 election. This dramatic graph shows how the pandemic movie traveled on Facebook, eclipsing other sort of pop culture events like the reunion of The Office staff or Taylor Swift's City of Lover release. You can see that the pink line eclipses the others by a fair amount. Then the ABCDs come together when you look at an actual campaign like Pizzagate, which took place up the street from me in Washington, D.C. Who are actors? Initially, after the Clinton email probe was launched, one person tweeted about a Clinton-led pedophilia ring. We don't know where they got that information from, but that's how it started. Engaged people traveled via social media, and here comes another actor, Alex Jones, who made a YouTube video that got over 400,000 views about the situation. Then with the email leaks from WikiLeaks of John Podesta's emails mentioning innocently words like pizza and Comet Ping Pong, which is the name of the restaurant, suddenly we had a message that said that Clinton is running a pedophilia ring in the basement of Comet Ping Pong. Another far-right influencer, Jack Posobiec, makes a Periscope video from the restaurant talking about this supposed sex ring in the restaurant. It becomes a hashtag, and by December 4th, someone shows up with an assault rifle to investigate. Unfortunately, the businesses all along this were targeted with calls, people showing up, death threats, and so on. These are how these campaigns travel. Now, what about our role, though, as information consumers? How do we influence the spread of falsehoods? A few different ways. Our brains make assumptions. Our emotions. We're specifically targeted with very personal messages, and then what we call the disinformation polarization cycle. We refer to a Cambridge professor named Dr. Sander van der Linden, here's his book, in learning about the fact that truth bias occurs in our brains. We just tend to think things we read and see are true. We're going to default to true. Illusory truth. The more we hear something, the more likely we'll think it's true. Not just remember it, but the more likely we'll be to think it is true. So if you see a message across channels, you're going to be more apt to think it's true. Meaning channels is a communications term that we mean social media channels, mainstream media, whatever maybe you see it on TV. Confirmation bias we've heard more about. That's believing information, even seeking it out, that backs up and confirms what we already believe or suspect. So let's say you see somebody on Messenger shares this AP article about a Pennsylvania county where a printer broke down. And he uses this to share a claim of fraud. And you're intrigued by this. Maybe you'll take it into Facebook and share it yourself with simple kind of pensive note. We call this interesting if true. You're not in this moment necessarily fully caring whether this is a true or false assumption. You either want to be the bearer of breaking news, or you just think of, wow, if it is true, that's super interesting. This is my partner again, talking about the link between our emotions and misinformation. You have to remember that the most successful misinformation succeeds by appealing to emotions rather than reason. Where does that emotion come from? Our identities as people. We don't have one identity, we have many. So if we're angered by a certain piece of content, it tracks through to something that is part of our makeup. And it affects how we may or may not share it. Individual targeting of people and groups is one way disinformation purveyors are able to achieve their goals. In this instance, 66% of Latinos saw false information about Democrats tampering with ballots, and 33% reported it true or probably true. Also in 2022, Equis research tested false claims with a large group of Latino adults and found high levels of familiarity with the claims, but less acceptance of those claims than you may see in the headlines. The majority didn't accept the claims, though they did express uncertainty. 22% believed one of the false claims, 25% believed two or more. Interestingly, these individuals were primarily even English dominant. So here we're refuting a few misperceptions. One, that misinformation acceptance is high among Latinos. And another is that, stereotypically speaking, lower educational levels and political engagement lead to susceptibility. In fact, those that were in that sort of tier 3 of believing more than one falsehood were politically engaged, college educated, even affluent. These strategies that are shared that were upon further analysis of this data, shared by the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas, who issues all of their work in both Spanish and Portuguese, suggests that we understand subgroups. We know that the Latino culture is not a monolith, but we need to look at information consumption on a subgroup basis, debunking false narratives and pre-bunking them as well. Meaning, let's anticipate what the falsehoods that may come and give people a heads up. Here's what you may see. The importance of trusted messengers can't be understated with this community, but with any community. A good way to debunk disinformation is to, as a trusted messenger, share a different perspective in a respectful way. And then obviously, as we see disinformation, in-group, out-group thinking, and the polarization that we're experiencing in our spaces right now, in my workshops, I find that people care about this almost more than anything else. So the important thing, and what everybody wants to know is, okay, great, I understand, but what can I do about it? So I have 10 ways that we're able to respond. And one of the truth in common messages is that we care enough to respond. I appreciate all of you for being here today, because that shows you're at least curious and that you probably care that falsehoods are coursing through our spaces and making it difficult for people to access the truth. We each, in our power and in our sphere, can have influence and be a trusted messenger ourselves. So what can we do? I'm not going to read through all of these because I'll go through them in the slides. I'll let you read them yourself, and I'll explain in just a minute. So taking these threats seriously is very important. Sometimes we can use a little bit of arrogance when we think about how we use and share information. This problem, for example, is someone else's problem. I'm so well-read. I can't possibly believe these things. Again, I would say the threats are high enough that each of us should feel called to do what we can. People like this slide because it sort of shows all of the groups that are working really hard on this issue. Entities like the League of Women Voters and the library falls into this category in the lower right. Quality journalism. Now there are beat reporters that cover mis and disinformation. Libraries as sources of what we call civic information. It's not just journalism that we get our information from. It's a very important source, but there's municipal sources as well, all accessible at the library. Policymakers have been working on this issue ever since I've been paying attention to it. The EU and the UK are a little ahead of the US, but especially when it comes to the harms of social media on children, people are making some progress. There's many different spheres of research that are informing what we know about mis and disinformation. Social sciences, cybersecurity, tech policy, and other areas of research. Even philosophers are in the game. I've had some of the best conversations with philosophers. People have philosophy PhD. That's how they're studying how we acquire knowledge. the fixers, who I call the cybersecurity types, and the crisis communicators that are helping organizations that may be targeted by these campaigns. And we all live sort of in the middle. People in communities and businesses, parents, adults, youth, who are consuming information and are at risk of confusion and even harm. Proceeding with grace is about showing and modeling empathy toward those who've bought into falsehoods. Again, setting aside our perhaps arrogant nature to say, oh, those people are just gullible. No, these campaigns are very powerful. Any one of us can fall down a rabbit hole. I have a kind of sad but fascinating story of a friend from church who was in the foreign service, has multiple degrees, lived in Russia for years, and still bought into the message of the pandemic the book shared, which was that the COVID-19 pandemic was a hoax and Anthony Fauci was party to it. Any of us can fall for them. Stemming emotional reactions. This is one of the top tips. Naming it to tame it is something that we borrow from IREX, which has a great curriculum called Learn to Discern. This is evidence-based. If you notice that you're having a strong emotional reaction to social media content, what you can do in your mind is name it. Say, wow, that's making me so angry. And to yourself. That's so fascinating. Wow, I knew that was true. If you name those emotions silently in your mind, it gives you the pause that you need to check their source. This is evidence-based. Checking sources. Some of the false content that we see, and Mackenzie will go into this more, is easier to identify than others. Some of us look at an outlet like this and think, oh, that's a bunch of crap. But others may look at it and say, that's so interesting because I had heard about this FBI thing and let me read more. Well, what do we see? So this is an opinion outlet. Obviously, discerning between opinion and fact is super important. These kind of cheesy ads right up at the top are a signal that this is not a legitimate source of information. You can look at the social platforms that encourages you to share the article through. A mainstream source of a mainstream media outlet would have just a few. These have a whole lot, and some of them are sort of fringe. These are all indicators that this is not content that you'll really want to believe. On the other side, we have Agence France Presse, which goes by AFP now because it's not, their reporting is no longer just relegated to France. In fact, they have an incredible global fact-checking platform now called AFP Fact Check. This is a very detailed article. If you wanted to Google it, you wouldn't have much trouble, that debunks this FBI, this sort of falsehood that the FBI was somehow in on the Capitol insurrection and that there were FBI operatives on the ground. It's a detailed study of the situation that debunks every single thing. You can follow fact checks like these as if they're a media outlet themselves, which they are. And then checking facts. This is an example of me checking my own self on facts. When I remembered this story, I've told the story of Black voters in Milwaukee so many times that this is how I remembered it, that the story was about Black voters in Milwaukee were targeted. Then I sort of forced myself to check, and I found that actually it was Black voters in 16 battleground states. And in fact, here's a more specific thing than the campaign was successful. Black voter turnout overall declined. So when we force ourselves to be detail-oriented and really check our facts, it can be pretty telling. You can tell a much more authentic and factual and accurate story. I want to spend a little time, and then I'm going to pick things up a little bit so we can get to Mackenzie, because I know you're all dying to learn about AI. But so when we think about curating, when we think about checking sources, it's much easier if you have an array of sources at your fingertips. None of us should really be following just one source of information anyways, but there's many ways, many apps that allow us to curate the news where we intentionally, rather than just being a passive watcher of news, whatever news happens to come our way, we become more active and say, here are the outlets that I want to follow. And we download something like Google News, which is a news aggregator that allows us to see a variety of outlets, and it's free. Apple does the same thing. You've got it. If you've an iPhone, you see it there in your apps, and you may get possible notifications. This one is paid. You have to pay $13 a month. Then there's, of course, following your outlets on social media. Not just saying, oh, did my friend happen to share an article on Instagram, but actually following news outlets. They all have handles now. I've got Twitter here, even though, as we know, it's a bit of a hot mess because content moderation has been completely eliminated, verification, etc. However, it is still a source of breaking news. Municipalities, governments, etc., rely on Twitter when at times of, for example, natural disasters. However, Threads is emerging as a really solid Twitter replacement, so to speak. I use it frequently. I encourage you to get on it. And if you're on Instagram already, you can get onto Threads. It's basically automatic. Everybody that you follow on Instagram will be a follower on Threads. And now a lot of, especially given what's happened with Twitter, a lot of journalists are on LinkedIn. You can follow them there. You can simply download the Associated Press app, a nonprofit that covers all breaking news around the world from a nonprofit perspective, balanced quality reporting. And please follow your local news outlets. It's super important as local news goes under further threat. Follow them, sign up for their newsletters, pay if you can. Where we want to use caution is Telegram. These are channels, right? They're not news originators, but Telegram is where a lot of sort of bad actors hang out. TikTok, a lot of news organizations are there, but unfortunately, youth, for example, are relying more and more on TikTok for news. It's a sort of sad story that came out a few months ago. If I had kids, I do have kids, teenagers, and one who's 20. If they had TikTok, I would be sort of strongly encouraging them to follow news outlets there because you can. And the new YouTube algorithm has gotten better, but it's still a source of rabbit hole behavior. One thing we need to do is really support disinformation research. They've been targeted by Congress. These mostly women have been subject to death threats. Their families have been attacked. It's not right because we have to have independent research on the platforms to understand what's going on in social media. So we must resist notions that it's too political or in somehow opposition to the First Amendment, which covers government interference in speech, not private universities or even public ones. Talk about it. The Stanford Polarization and Social Change Lab's experiment called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge found that simply correcting misperceptions about the other side's beliefs and/or spending time with people whose viewpoints are different helped diminish in-group, out-group thinking and support for political violence and animosity. Think about it. Just being with someone who's different, whose viewpoints are different from your own, helps correct perhaps some of the perceptions they have about you. And in the process, maybe you can have a conversation. The goal is that we're going into conversations with that as the goal, to have a conversation, not to change anyone's mind. That's really hard for people. Down the road, perhaps you can have a more in-depth conversation. But for now, we're just trying to listen. You go very far by listening. This year, I want to encourage everyone to truly take a stand for truth and democracy. It's going to be one of the rougher years that we've experienced. Again, you can share election-related information. You can pre-bunk, hey, this is what I participated in a webinar the other day. Already, deepfakes are being used in elections. We have to really make sure if we see a message from a trusted messenger, that we really make sure it's real. It's being shared by a legitimate outlet, whatever. But I also wanted to instill hope. These are just a few of my partners that are working every single day to support and defend our democracy, including setting up elections infrastructure in vulnerable states, meaning directly setting things up so they can thwart possible election sabotage down the road. So there's a lot of hope, a lot of people working on this issue. And then, of course, you can host a Truth in Common workshop or a talk like this with your community. So I have long lists of sources to share that I'm not going to get into now, but we'll be able to, I believe we'll be able to share the list with you after the email after the event. But now I want to turn things over to Mackenzie Sadaji of NewsGuard, We're really lucky to have her here. NewsGuard it does incredible things in terms of helping us understand what sources of information are quality and which are not. So she's going to talk more about that. And thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Deanna, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. As Deanna had emphasized, mis and disinformation can have real life impacts. And today I'm going to speak a little bit about the role AI plays when it comes to this, how we can remain vigilant, and some of the trends that we have seen when it comes to AI and misinformation. So when we look at AI and the role it can play, there's three main ways that it can spread misinformation. And the first being is the chatbots that are used to generate this text and videos and deepfakes that we had touched on earlier. And what our research has found is that with just a few prompts, these tools can generate detailed articles, essays, TV scripts, spreading blatant falsehoods, whether that's about politics or health or wars. And this is concerning because in the hands of a bad actor, this can be used to influence voters, share false and misleading information online. So our research has found that despite all of this heightened attention on artificial intelligence companies, not much progress has been made when it comes to safeguards and their propensity to spread misinformation. As you can see here, our audits on two of the leading chatbots, Google's Bard and OpenAI's ChatGPT, found that they had no problem spreading misinformation when we directly prompted them to. So in this example here, you can see ChatGPT repeating the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen in the form of an article. So imagine something like this being used about actor taking this text, sharing it online to mislead people about the voting process. And then another example here is similarly Bard spreading misinformation about the 2020 election in the form of the Gateway Pundit, which, as we had mentioned earlier, is not a credible website and has previously spread misinformation.
Mackenzie, we can't see your slides. It seems to be loading.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can see them. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so the use of AI when it comes to misinformation isn't limited to online bad actors. We've also already seen instances of state media in Russia and China citing responses from these chatbots to advance unsubstantiated claims. So here on the left, last April, we found in Chinese state media using a response from ChatGPT to advance a false claim about biolabs. And then similarly, around the same time, we found that Russia was using a conversation that it had had with ChatGPT to advance false claims about the 2014 Ukrainian revolution. And one of the most alarming trends that we've seen when it comes to AI and the role it plays is the spread of unreliable AI-generated news sites, which we have been actively tracking since early last year. And we define an unreliable AI-generated news site based on these 4 criteria, with the first being that there is clear evidence that a substantial portion of the site's content is produced by AI. So on the article to the right here, you can see a site that presents itself as a normal, typical news outlet, calls itself the News Network, and publishes AI-generated articles containing error messages. And the presence of these error messages indicates that there is little to no human oversight with this content, and that it's being completely generated with AI. And to the average reader, a site like this may appear credible when they're using benign names such as the News Network. And on top of that, these sites are not clearly disclosing to readers their practice of using AI to generate news content. And the reason why this is concerning is because, as we've seen in previous elections, there have been a number of websites in battleground swing states posing as local news sites that actually have partisan interests and political ties and exploit the trust in local news in an attempt to influence voters. So on the left and on the right here, you see 2 local news outlets in Philadelphia that appear trustworthy, except one is credible and has existed for decades, while the other one is tied to conservative PACs and does not disclose its political ties. And with the rollout of AI, we can start to see these political websites using these new technologies to promote their content, to generate articles or photos or videos, and use that to influence voters in their respective states. And this isn't limited to just online content. We've also seen a lot of these operations use print papers. So during the 2022 midterms, we saw that some of these partisan outlets were sending print mailers to voters around the state, and basically were masquerading as local news outlets without disclosing their ties. And we've seen that this trend has only gotten worse, and that these partisan funded sites are on the verge of outnumbering local news sites in the US. So we first started tracking unreliable AI-generated news sites at NewsGuard in early May, and the number of these websites has only grown on a weekly basis. We're finding about a dozen new sites every single week, and as of today, it stands at 650, up from 49 in May, and we suspect that this will only continue to get worse, and these sites will only continue to grow in number as we approach the 2024 election. And as the primaries play out, we're also starting to see that false narratives about the 2024 election are already starting to emerge online. Here is a claim that spread earlier this year suggesting that an internet apocalypse would occur before the 2024 presidential election, sort of aiming to evoke fear and distrust. And then we're also seeing narratives about candidates who are running. A lot of these narratives are sort of taking narratives that we've seen in previous elections and taking on a new variation. So we saw in the past election where people were claiming that Barack Obama or Kamala Harris were not eligible candidates to run based on their parents' citizenship status. And that's something we're starting to see play out as well. To the right here, you can see that this was a claim spread about Nikki Haley, and sources on the left and the right falsely claiming that she is ineligible to serve as president. And this trend is not limited just to the US. We've also seen AI being used in elections in other countries. In Slovakia's election, AI was used to spread a fake audio about one of the candidates running, and experts had really emphasized how this was one of the first real-life examples of the role and the dangers AI can play when it comes to voting. So with all that being said, there are a number of things we can do to remain vigilant and be on alert and double check our sources. Our approach is to always analyze the source of the claim. Is it credible? Is it transparent? Does it disclose who owns the site? Is it telling you who wrote the article? Does it disclose where it gets its funding from? And also checking primary sources, going straight to the county data, government reports, court documents, scholars and experts, and firsthand accounts. We also have a browser extension, which I believe is included in the resources list at the end, but our browser extension will show you the credibility and transparency of a website based on our 9 apolitical scoring process, where we look at whether or not the site labels advertising, does it differentiate between news and opinion, and things of that sort. And this icon will appear online when you're browsing on social media or on search engines looking for news, and you can read the detailed write-ups explaining our score and our reasoning and how we got to that score. And we always reach out to the sources that we are rating for comment and give them a chance to comment on their editorial and transparency practices. And now I will turn it back to Deanna, and I believe we'll open it up for questions.
Well, I can jump in and start on the 2 that have already been posted. Does that sound good, folks? Okay. Peter asked about the Netflix film, The Social Dilemma. I think it's a great, first of all, I really believe in multimedia as a way to learn. It's engaging, podcasts, right? Not but where you can have legitimate and well-told stories. It's a great way to learn. I understand that I'm breaking up just a tiny bit here and there, so I apologize for that. I love the film, The Social Dilemma. Helps us understand how Facebook got its start. I also would love to recommend The Great Hack, which tells that Cambridge Analytica story in a fair amount of detail and is pretty fascinating. So really thank you for asking about that on the podcast realm. Just, you didn't ask about that, but I'll just throw in that the Rabbit Hole podcast tells a good story about a young person who was radicalized on YouTube and how those algorithms contributed to it. The changes I think it addresses the changes in the algorithms and reaction, et cetera, but that's a great podcast. A little more sort of intense is the Hard Fork podcast, which is Casey Newton of Platformer and New York Times is Kevin Bruce. That's a little more of a chatty style, but really go a little bit deeper on the platform situation. And then Steve asked about, why do you not give a single example of a mainstream outlet giving misinformation? Which I really appreciate the question. And what comes to mind for me is the New York Times and other outlets getting the story behind the Gaza bombing of the hospital completely wrong. Mackenzie, you may have great examples too, but I'm going to add that to my presentation. I, as you can see, am an advocate of quality news. I believe we need it to live our lives. But with that said, news outlets are not perfect. No one said they were. I don't think it's helpful to ever generalize the media this or that. In fact, I will push back on it every time because we rely on journalists to keep us informed, to track, hold leaders accountable, et cetera. But they're not perfect. And sharing an example can at least make it clear that we're not, that we're having an open and honest conversation about journalism and the media. Mackenzie, I don't know if you want to chime in on that one, on either of these, frankly.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I think we all make mistakes, especially in mainstream media as well. And the important part is if that information is corrected or not. A recent example that comes to mind with mainstream media spreading misinformation was the hospital blast in with the Israel-Hamas war, where we saw a lot of credible media outlets initially stating as fact that Israel was behind that, and within a few days went back and either changed that or added corrections to clarify that it wasn't immediately clear who was responsible for the blast and that it was irresponsible to initially blame it on Israel without having all of the facts verified.
And then Mackenzie, it looks like there's one for you about going back, if you can, to your slide about the sources of the claims. One of your last slides, I guess.
Yes.
And there's one of as well too about visual AI examples.
Is this the slide you were referencing?
I'm guessing yes.
Okay. So yeah, we look at, you can see here, these are the main things that we look at, but we analyze whether it discloses ownership and financing content creators. So does it have a byline, a name of a journalist and their background and their contact information? Does it publish false information? Is it labeling opinion as such and labeling news? Is it labeling advertising and sponsored content on the site? So those are the main things that we look at and we think readers should know when they are reading news and information. And then for fact-checking information online, we go straight to the primary source. So that's court documents, firsthand accounts, things of that nature.
Looks like Sue has a question about how do you suggest influencing those who think there are two truths, not one? For example, Fox has its truth about a certain topic and MSNBC has its truth. You know, one of the philosophers that I chat with from time to time wrote a book called Post-Truth. And I have to say that I absolutely detest that term. There are opinions and then there are facts. We have to, you know, I know that there's this sort of trend to say like, oh, we're in a post-truth world and, you know, we don't know what to believe anymore. And no one knows, you know, kind of where to find the truth. But there are certain things that are true. And sometimes it takes a more discerning eye. And in other words, we have to give ourselves some time to read longer content to be able to understand the story enough to understand that it's irrefutable. For example, I'll just take as an example the Georgia indictment. Now, people will have their opinions about the Georgia indictment or even the claim that the 2020 election was stolen. You're welcome to your opinion on that. But if you read the Georgia indictment, for example, which I did, I read it every word, and then I extracted the story of Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss that showed in stark detail. The indictment goes through detail evidence of taking surveillance footage and telling a story about it that was patently untrue. You know, what was claimed that the woman was pulling out a flash drive was actually a piece of wrapped candy. So if you read the content, you are able to sort of understand that certain things are irrefutable, but you do need to take the time to read it. So, you know, I think that if you can have a conversation with people in your life who are struggling to find the facts they need to live their lives or to refute certain perspectives, you know, you can, I have actually a bookmark with some listening tools, some listening kind of words that we can use to simply say, tell me more. That just seems, you know, I mean, you want to exhibit listening skills when you're in conversation with someone. You give them the time of day, and then perhaps you can work down to wow, that seems so different from what I've seen. Hey, do you want, it's almost a level of fascination, right? Like, wow, that's so interesting. I see something completely different. Show your curiosity, and then maybe you intrigue someone else's curiosity and you can share a source. So I do think it's important to push back on this notion that there are multiple truths about a certain, there's complex situations, and lots of times we don't do a good job of what we say, complicating the narrative, right? We want to just live in the headlines or live in the social media, 140 characters. But, that's what I kind of mean about taking a stand for the truth. That's a long answer, but that's my perspective. I appreciate the question. Mackenzie, how about this one from Bob Barrett? Is that Bob Barrett that I know? Hello. So, what do you think about All Sides?
All Sides Media, the rating?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're great.
The other one is Ad Fontes.
Yeah, we've used them, and I think they do great work. And I think it's really helpful when you're looking at information to look at it from multiple different sides. There are a lot of organizations like All Sides who present this, and it really helps you see a different view and challenge your own beliefs and your own perspectives on, contentious topics.
Yeah, agree. And I also recommend Ad Fontes Media. These do basically there's no truly bucketing a media outlet by bias. I mean, we all have personal bias. Like, bias is something that happens in our brains. Like, it just happens, and individuals are the ones doing the reporting, hopefully. So bias will happen, but trained journalists are researchers at heart. And to the question that Linton is raising about media holding everyone else accountable and not themselves, I was going back and forth with a friend on certain topics that we disagreed wholeheartedly on. And he kept saying, the media didn't report it, the media didn't do this. And I must have said 100 times, you should call them up, send it to them. A quality media outlet will listen if you have a legitimate area of contention or something that you're contesting in their reporting. And they will, if they've gotten it wrong, a legitimate outlet will print a retraction. I mean, that's sort of one of the ways that we sort of discern between a quality outlet and an outlet that's not high quality. So now staffing plays into that, right? Right, as outlets are decimated. I mean, there's stories of outlets that were staff of 34 covering a smallish city to a staff of 2. So are they going to have as much bandwidth to address every single question or sort of challenge that they get? Maybe or maybe not. That's when we have to sort of give them a break. But a good outlet should hold themselves accountable. It's a great question. And if they don't, then go into the comments and tell them so and call them up. Send them an email. I don't think you got this right. You can also post letters to the editor, which gives you a voice to say, I don't agree. You basically, they want a comment. A quality outlet will want commentary on its work. So post a letter to the editor. It's a great way to get yourself published and say, this article was posted. I don't agree, and here's evidence as to why. And then there's also, so letters to the editor, you can write a longer op-ed if you like. There needs to be a discernment that there's opinion news and journalistic news. Absolutely right. I have a slide that actually at one point I was sort of showing the primetime lineup for both CNN and Fox. And it was all opinion on both sides. So, it's talking heads are going to have a level of opinion. That's just the way it goes. So, and if you see the same issue reported on as the night goes on, turn it off. What's your opinion on that, Mackenzie, in terms of like discerning opinion versus journalism? How do we help people do that?
Yeah, I think that's really important because opinionated journalism is a lot different than straightforward news. And I think it really is on news outlets to properly label that information and tell you when it is opinion and commentary versus news, even if just some part of the article includes commentary. that's important to people, for people to know. And I think too, when you're citing articles or information to make an argument, it's important to note that whether or not something you are citing is commentary from someone who may have a certain belief or take a certain side on the issue versus a straightforward, factual-based news report.
Why don't you take Maura's question to Mackenzie? This is a great question. Do you see it?
I'm not seeing them for some reason.
Oh, sorry. It says, my understanding is that a degree in journalism means that, and this is Mackenzie's background, means that the person has graduated from a rigorous program at a credentialed university. They understand fact checking, credible sources, statistics, etc. It's a BS, not a BA. As an undergrad, probably. Lawyers take an ethics oath and can be censured by the state bar. I know there are many lawyers who are not reputable, but a mechanism exists to disqualify them from appearing in court. Should journalism have a similar ethics requirement? Great question.
And a lot of newsrooms have their own personal ethics guidelines that they make their reporters follow. At our organization, we have our own ethics guidelines where, you know, we promise to leave politics out the door. So I think it's really important, and it's really great when newsrooms implement these ethics guidelines that they make their reporters adhere to. And I know the Society of Professional Journalists and some other organizations have similar ones as well that are sort of implemented across the board.
Thank you. Linton, I love your comment too about there's no such thing as truth, there's facts in your interpretation of the facts. So, right, so truth being as a term, a little squishier than the term fact. Great point. Hopefully you all can read Linton's input in the Q&A there. How are social media companies such as Facebook and YouTube, sorry interpreters if I've started speaking quickly, I'm gonna try to slow down. What have they been doing to filter out dis and misinformation? Are they prepared for the election? This is the, what a $60,000 question or whatever that adage is. So content moderation has been, decimated from a resource perspective, pretty much across the board on the social media platforms. There's been a lot of challenges in terms of content moderation, sort of being going against the First Amendment, interference in speech. That's what it's about. So you can debate whether that content moderation is a First Amendment violation or not, but certainly we protect free speech in this country, and content moderation is very dicey. There's been a lot of research that says we should be checking the virality of content, not saying take it up or take it down. So you can kind of debate content moderation as long as it, serves all day long if you want. It's a complicated thing to do, and frankly, the resources aren't there to do it anymore. And Mackenzie, I'd love your take on that. But so are they prepared for the 2024 election? In my opinion, they are not. And that's why it really falls to individual social media users to be really skeptical this year, understanding that social media platforms are channels. They're not information sources. They are as good as the information that someone shares there. So they're not news sources. So you still want to check your sources and check your facts. What do you think, Mackenzie?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When these social media platforms started to emerge, we saw that they employed algorithms, and as a result, these algorithms were inadvertently promoting misinformation, and people were being incentivized to spread misinformation, and not much was being done. I think in recent years, with the 2020 election and the pandemic, we have seen a lot more people pay attention to the issue and take it more seriously, which is great. A lot of these platforms have taken a number of steps to try and mitigate this, whether that's hiring independent fact checkers or adding content moderators and adjusting their community guidelines. But given all of the steps that they have taken, to this day, we're seeing misinformation is still a huge issue on these platforms, with the 2022 midterms and the Israel-Hamas war and the Russia-Ukraine war. So it still exists and it's still persistent despite all of the efforts that have been made. And I think it is important for users to always remain aware and double check their sources on social media.
Thank you. Linton has served as a journalist and anchor for the NBC Bay Area affiliate for years. Thank you for your service. And is saying from personal experience that journalists make mistakes and don't turn retractions regularly or hold ourselves accountable. So that's what we call lived experience. Thank you for that. You know, someone has asked, what's the first news source you check in the morning? For me, it's NPR. We wake up to it. My husband and I, we listen to PBS at night. You'll see in my list of outlets, I recommend the nonprofit outlets pretty frequently. But I'd love to also crowdsource this. What do others, we cannot see all the questions which Deanna is addressing. So if you look on the Q&A box, like at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A little icon. If you click on that, I think you should be able to see the questions. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm trying to read them out.
That may be something that just the panelists can see.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay, we'll make sure we read them out here. So if anybody wants to share, let's crowdsource what your first outlet that you consume in the morning, or your first source of news or information that you look to in the morning in the Q&A. Feel free. What about you, Mackenzie?
I love Axios. I usually read their newsletters in the morning. I've also started listening to podcasts a lot more recently. I love the New York Times' daily podcast. So those are new recently.
Do others want to chime in? Let's see. AP, that's a couple answers. NPR, AP. In my experience, NPR comes up most often when we sort of in what people have in common across viewpoint. And NPR, for me at least, comes up more often than not. Associated Press, you can't go wrong. MSNBC, a follower of Heather Cox Richardson, who is an historian who has an incredible newsletter on Substack, I think, and also is pretty frequent poster to social media. She posts to Twitter regularly, and I think it's crossed over to Threads, but I don't see her as much there. Bannon's War Room. All right, Stephen. Steve Bannon's War Room. Got it. The Daily, I'm also a daily listener myself. NPR every day, Sean says. Yay for the Daily. The Daily is explainer. So there's a phenomenon called explainer journalism, which is, I'm going to go deep on a particular story because there's just, to fully understand what was going on, we need more information. And that's why I personally like the Daily. Axios' podcast used to do that too. Another one that is, but now it's not, they don't do the Daily podcast anymore, I think. If people aren't familiar with Axios and you're sort of a TLDR person and you don't really want to read really long form journalism, Axios is a great choice because they have a methodology of bulleting out information, put the most important stuff up front, and if they say, why does it matter? So that's a great choice if you're sort of, I want it short and sweet.
Another great outlet too, kind of going back to the question about labeling opinion, is Semaphore, which I don't know if you guys have heard of, but they provide the story, the facts, and then the journalist's opinion at the bottom. So for each article, it has a little section basically acknowledging that their reporter does have a view or opinion on it, and they present that there in the article and label it as such.
Great. That's a great point. I love that. And I just was looking at that. One of my board members actually is sort of is a consults for Semaphore, and I was just sort of digging in there the other day myself. It's kind of a name that makes it seem quite, niche or almost elitist. But if you can look past the name and go to the website, you can see it. And they have a newsletter you can sign up for. Sean recommends Slate's Amicus podcast, excellent for understanding legal issues, as is Lawfare's podcast, if you're interested in legal issues. I was going to recommend Vox Today Explained, similar explainer journalism. Thank you to Linton, had to dial off, but I just want to read this comment. I truly appreciate everyone's work on this. I've just launched a blockchain-based journalism platform called Ovis. Our mission is to end fake news by incentivizing truth. Go team. We have launched our pilot in Hayward, California. Check us out at ovisnews.com. This is right in the chat. And our marketing platform at Ovis News. Wow, love it. Thank you and keep up the great work. Linton at ovis.news. Rock on. What do you think about the stance the EU has taken on AI? And do you believe the US? This is from Diane. Sorry, interpreters. I just started picking up the pace. What do you think about the stance the European Union has taken on AI? And do you believe the US will move forward soon and do the same? What do you believe are important guardrails the US government should establish? Mackenzie probably is a good person to share on this, but I will say from my perspective that I listened to my research partners testify, got up at 4 a.m. to listen to EU testifying in front of UK Parliament on platform transparency. So my guess is that they would be a little ahead, as Diane, you point out, on regulating AI. It's super difficult. But just wanted to acknowledge that the Digital Services Act in the EU is, just like when we now you have to disclose cookies on your site, we follow the EU in many policy areas, or the UK. I'm sort of blending them together, and you asked about the EU in particular. But Mackenzie, I'd love to hear your take on this one, policy perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with the EU, we've seen them take much more of a regulatory approach, in looking at, the safety and ethical considerations, and also the transparency when it comes to these AI and these large language models, looking at the risks that they face and what they can do to help regulate that. I think in the US, we have seen growing awareness from government officials, the private sector, researchers, and there has been a lot of discussions and hearings about the need for AI regulation and safety. But I think we're still seeing that play out. With that being said, though, there's been a lot of increasing calls for transparency of the data being used to train these large language models, which I think is, the most important part of it all. People need to know if we're trained on reliable, accurate information. We're seeing, instances of copyright and lawsuits emerging as well, privacy and data and things of that sort, looking at their bias. So I think those are all different guardrails and things that AI companies should look at or are already currently looking at.
Thank you, Mackenzie. I will say in the US, given somewhat of a stalemate in Congress, to the extent that there's an effect on kids, that seems to be what's needed to get it in bipartisan support around anything related to tech. We saw it happen with Instagram for kids back during the time of the Facebook whistleblower. When it was revealed that Instagram was specifically targeting kids and even setting up a dedicated platform for kids, meaning under 16, I think it was under 13, then Congress will step up in a bipartisan way. We saw it happening. So I don't know that we've seen the particular effects of synthetic content on kids specifically, or if we can even make that bucketing or that segmenting of the market, but that's where we've seemed to at least have some progress, if not actual passage of legislation. Oh, Moira is shouting out to the podcast Strict Scrutiny, which covers the Supreme Court. That's a great recommend. Plenty to talk about there. Oh, and Dee McKinney points out that it's important to check out what the opposition is saying. So when we diversify our news sources through an aggregator or something else, include outlets that share hopefully quality information, not fake information, but that differs from your own. I have a Wall Street Journal subscription that you could say is sort of more centrist, but because I am a left-leaning person, which you may have gleaned, but I keep apprised to what folks are saying in the Wall Street Journal, other outlets as well. Great recommendation. Judy Frost, so glad I tuned in. Thank you for sharing information and appreciate the work. Thank you, Judy. I think, someone shouted out to the Poynter Institute and the Society of Professional Journalists, which have ethics standards. Poynter is a great resource. They are an institute that is designed to train journalists and also has an incredible fact-checking platform and resources for the public as well. I don't know if you have more to say on that, Mackenzie, but we're a fan. Yeah. I recommend ProPublica all the time as well. If you want investigative journalism on particular issues, very high quality, ProPublica.
Yeah, I think Poynter is great. They've been doing a lot of great work about AI too. Also, the International Fact Checking Network, which they're partnered with, is a great organization as well.
So Susan is saying it's time to wrap up questions. Are there any? Further questions? Bring in with your outlet suggestions. New York Times, Bob Barrett. New York Times, Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle. Thank you for mentioning a local outlet. You have very high quality reporting in the Bay Area. Also listen to NPR for politics. I follow Heather Cox Richardson, God bless her. She is doing incredible work. Letter from an American. And I check in with Talking Points Memo, Josh Marshall. My friend David Kurtz is the founder of Talking Points Memo. He lives up the street from me in DC. Everything. I live in the city, so sort of everything's up the street from me in DC. But yeah, glad to find a Talking Points Memo fan. That is a kind of a rapid response, always been a newsletter, always will be kind of in DC insider politics outlet. Great recommendations, Bob. Thank you. So I don't see any further questions, and I'm happy to turn things back over to the awesome team at the League of Women Voters if you'd all like to take over, and put myself back on mute. Thank you to everyone for your input and your insights. You know, we all have such good input and insights and lived experience and great stuff to offer. So I'm all for these community approaches. Thank you.
This has been great. Thank you so much. I saw the enthusiastic questions and responses from the audience. I think they've got a great great insights into the work that you do and why it's so important and how they can utilize it in these upcoming elections, which are so important. And I thank you for working with our team in pulling together this webinar. And Albert, when you're ready, if you can show those, great. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley, the League of Women Voters West Contra Costa County Library, and CCTV, I want to extend a genuine thank you to Deanna Troust and Mackenzie Sadaji for being here today to offer such an informative and timely conversation on misinformation, disinformation, how to recognize and respond to it. Thank you, Deanna Troust, for sharing your expertise and for helping our audience better understand the threat of mis and disinformation. Thank you, Mackenzie Sadaji from NewsGuard, for sharing your knowledge and providing tools to empower our audience. I also want to thank our audience for attending today and for their important questions. Thank you to Pamela Perales for providing the Spanish interpretation of today's webinar. This service is jointly funded by the Contra Costa County Library and the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley. Today's community conversation will be rebroadcast on CCTV on the following days and time, and we'll take a minute for you to see that schedule right now. Disinformation, how to recognize and respond to it, will also be available on the YouTube channels of the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley and the Contra Costa County Library. Please save the date for our next community conversation on February 15th, 2024 at 4 p.m. on Measure X 2023, the allocations, lessons learned, and ensuring equity in 2024. Community conversation programs are a partnership between the League of Women Voters Diablo Valley, the League of Women Voters West Contra Costa County, the Contra Costa County Library, and CCTV. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. The League never endorses or opposes candidates or political parties. The League influences public policy through education and advocacy. We invite everyone to join the League and support the work we do at lwvc.org/join. Thank you, everyone, and good night.